This morning's reading is Ruth chapter 2, starting at the beginning. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi said to her daughter, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she had wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is one of our close relatives. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth, the Moabite, said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Amen.
Thank you, Marilyn. Never sure if that last line is the most ominous bit of the whole story. She lived with her mother-in-law. Well, as you might have guessed, we are continuing a short journey through the story of Ruth. Mark kicked us off a couple of weeks ago. Thank you, Mark. We're carrying on, and I think we're probably going to take one more week and do chapters 3 and 4 together, and then we've got something slightly different to do, and then we'll be hitting Advent and getting into our Advent series. So just a short stay in this story, but hopefully one that is worthwhile, because what a story this is. I know I've said that before, but what a story the story of Ruth is. You may be aware that actually it's one of only two narrative stories that are one of the five feastal scrolls, which are five books of the Old Testament scriptures that many Jewish communities read every single liturgical year. That's the prominence, that's the place that Ruth has in that tradition, read out in a synagogue in that way. But you can imagine, even way before it got to that kind of formal status and was read out in that way, this has been the sort of story that would be passed around through families and communities as they huddled around the fire of an evening and said, "Tell us a story, Dad, tell us a story about our past." The sort of story that travellers would come in and tell, often I imagine with embellishments at various points, but this story being passed on because it's so key, so formative in Israel's history. And part of the reason it's such a great story, of course, is because it follows the structure of all great stories. Think of those great stories that we know. I've gone completely blank now on any great stories. The Lion King. There must be others. Think of the way that great stories often work. They start off with things being relatively well, things being okay, and then it all takes a turn for worse as a nosedive of some sort, as things start to go wrong. And then towards the end, it starts to pick up again. And we start to see the possibility of hope, of redemption, of things being resolved in a good and positive way. Did you recognise that arc in so many different stories? It seems to be a thing particularly in rom-coms, the sort of thing that Julia watches and I try and avoid. But that's exactly what happens every single time. Starts up, dips down, then comes back up again at the end. And think about how frustrating and annoying it is when you've got through a book or a film or whatever it might be, and you don't get that uplift. It's all just down and down and down, and never quite resolves in any sort of positive way. It's gutting, isn't it? Because it takes you on this emotional journey, and you need it to resolve in some way. And of course, that's exactly what we see happening in the story of Ruth. And we see right at the start, well, we don't get a lot of things going well at the start. It does start to go downhill fairly quickly. But as Mark was talking about a couple of weeks ago, right from the beginning, we start to see things go wrong for Naomi and her family. There's a famine, we're told, in the land of Bethlehem. And so Elimelech and Naomi, or Elimelech particularly, decides that they're going to leave the land and go off and find food elsewhere, which, as Mark was saying, a perfectly reasonable decision from a human point of view, but immediately for those first audiences listening, they've been thinking, hold on a minute, he's turning his back on God. He's moving away from trusting in God. Then, of course, it gets worse because they keep travelling away from their hometown, keep travelling away from God in literal and metaphorical terms, and keep getting further and further away from him. Their sons end up marrying Moabite women, which had been expressly forbidden by God earlier on in the Old Testament. And the audience by this point thinking, no, what are you doing? What are you doing? But of course there's more to come, as first Elimelech and then his two sons die. And we're left with just Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, and Naomi in particular just feeling crushed. It's no wonder, is it, that she says when she goes back to Bethlehem, call me Mara, call me bitter, because I have been afflicted with so much. I am done. I am empty. There is no joy. There is no blessing in my life anymore. We're down there as an audience in the bottom of the pit with them. But then just towards the end of chapter 1, we start to see a couple of little glimmers of hope that this story isn't done yet, that there might be some sort of resolution. And the first glimmer of hope is the news coming in that actually there is food in Bethlehem once again, that God has chosen to bless the people there and allow the crops to grow once again. And then the second thing, of course, is Ruth, this Moabitess, the one whom many of the original audience listening wouldn't have expected much good to come from her. But she does show good. She shows love to Naomi. She shows commitment to Naomi. She shows faithfulness to Naomi. And as Mark was saying, the word that is used there is a word that crops up time and time again in this story. It's the word hesed. That often gets translated as covenant faithfulness. It's a word used most prominently talking about God's relationship with his people, his covenant faithfulness to his people. But here, right at the start of the story, we get Ruth showing covenant faithfulness, showing hesed to Naomi. And so we start to see just a slight turn up. Just the first hints that things might be all right, that it might be okay for Naomi. That things might resolve in a positive way. And it's all captured in that wonderful line right at the end of chapter 1 that says, as they arrived in Bethlehem, the barley harvest was just beginning. Things are on the turn, it seems. And having been taken on this emotional trip right down into the depths of Naomi's suffering, maybe we can begin to hope again. But of course, Naomi and Ruth are a long way from being out of the woods yet. Yes, they come back to Bethlehem, and yes, they've got each other, but they're still in an incredibly vulnerable position. Widows, as you probably know, at that time in that place, were really vulnerable. They had very few rights of any sort, no rights to any property or possessions or land, no claim they could make on anyone. They were literally at the mercy of others to look after them. It's part of the reason why so many times throughout the Old Testament, as God is giving the law, giving his instructions to how his people are to live, he makes it clear you are to pay special attention to, you are to give special care to orphans, widows, and aliens, meaning strangers, not Martians. Orphans, widows, and aliens, because they were considered to be the ones who had no rights in society. They were the ones who were the most vulnerable. And that's exactly, of course, the position that Naomi and Ruth are in. But part of the instruction that God gives throughout the Old Testament, kind of a theme running through the whole Old Testament law, is that one of the ways in which society can look after these people is to allow the practice of gleaning. Again, Mark talked about this a bit a couple of weeks ago. By the way, I'm assuming you all remember what Mark said. I had the advantage of listening to it again yesterday. It's more fresh in my mind. But do go back and listen to it. There's some really good stuff there. Thank you, Mark. The practice of gleaning. This idea, this instruction God gives to farmers in particular, when you're harvesting your field or your vineyard or whatever it might be, just leave a little bit behind. Don't go right to the edges, but just go nearly to the edge, but not quite to the edge. And don't pick all the olives from the trees or whatever it might be, but just leave a few up there. And allow others, allow the widows and the orphans and the strangers and whoever else might need it, to come along behind you and get some food that way. As I say, it's part of this theme running all the way through Old Testament law in which God wants to, it seems, reinforce a couple of different things to his people. Firstly, he wants them to understand that the blessings that they have, the things that they have, yes, they belong to them in some sense, but actually they're not really their own. That everything we have is a gift from God and is given to bless not just us, but others as well. There's this constant encouragement throughout the Old Testament to hold our possessions lightly and always be willing to give them away to those who are in need. And then the second thing that God seems to want to teach his people throughout, following on from that, is that he wants them to avoid building up this economic way of being in which a few accumulate more and more and more, whilst others go with less and less and less. And it's part of the reason why we get the radical debt forgiveness programs that we see with the Year of Jubilee and fallow fields and things like that. It's a way of God seemingly trying to reset the economy, trying to level out the playing field every so often so that it can't just get worse and worse and worse. It's a way of subverting that economy of greed and selfishness which was beginning to be a part and parcel of things then. And of course it's absolutely embedded in our economic thinking now. It's worth reflecting, I think, on what we can learn from these Old Testament ways of doing, from the instructions that God gives to his people. No, we don't hear the law in the same way as they did. We have Jesus, and therefore that transforms our understanding of the law. And yet there are principles here, there are values here, which have so much to teach us. And especially as we look around our world and our country, and we see that inequality growing and growing, it's time for change. It's time for people to start living differently. Maybe we as the church are the people called to start doing that, to think about how we can not spend our money on the basis of how much we can get, or how much we can accumulate, or how much we can keep tucked away for a rainy day. But how can we hold what we have lightly and use it for the benefit and the blessing of others? Go back and read the law, the whole law, and then let's talk about it some more. So anyway, this is the practice, gleaning, that Ruth decides that she needs to try and use in order to be able to feed them both for the weeks and months ahead. But just because God has mandated it and told Israel that they need to allow this practice doesn't mean that it's a particularly safe thing to do. As you can imagine, some of the farmers and some of the workers on the farms would be getting pretty grumpy about the idea of people coming along and taking free food away. And so workers would always be watching out to make sure that the gleaners coming along behind them weren't encroaching a bit too much into the main field, that they really were sticking to the edge. And of course, the very fact that so many of those doing the gleaning would have been widows would have placed them in a vulnerable position alongside these male farmhands. It wasn't a good or safe place necessarily to be. And so Ruth says to Naomi, look, I've got to go and do this, but I'm going to go out and hopefully I'll be able to find somewhere where I can find favour and will be allowed to glean in peace. And it's at this point that the narrator of the story gets lost a bit in the English, unfortunately, but seems to be playing around with us and certainly playing with those original audiences listening to this story around the fire. Because he takes on this tone of, so Ruth goes out to glean, and wouldn't you know it, completely by chance, she ends up gleaning in the field belonging to Boaz. Who'd have thought it? And of course, the audience would have been in uproar at this point because they've already met Boaz. We've all met Boaz. A couple of verses before, right at the start of the chapter, we were told who Boaz was. And it doesn't mean a huge amount to us, this idea of a kinsman redeemer and all that sort of thing. We'll be getting to that next week. But for that original audience listening, they'd be going, oh, it's Boaz. She's in Boaz's field. Oh, it's going to be all right. And then the narrator delights them even more because the very next line continues in a similar vein. So completely by chance, Ruth has ended up gleaning in this field belonging to Boaz. And then, would you believe it, Boaz himself came along. Who would believe it? The audience would have found this absolutely hilarious. By underplaying it, by implying that it's somehow by chance, of course, the narrator doesn't mean that at all. Because nobody at that time believed that anything happened by chance. Things like that didn't happen by luck or fortune or just sheer coincidence. Instead, they would have all had this strong belief that, no, this was God at work through it all. Not appearing in some explicit way. As Mark said, we don't hear God speaking in this story, or there's no attributable miracles to him or anything like that. But he's there as a character behind the scenes, just quietly moving things around, weaving things together, bringing these coincidences together, so that what appears to be completely by chance is in fact God at work, turning this story of such suffering, turning these people who've experienced so much rebellion and sin and brokenness and bitterness and all the rest of it, and bringing about a redemption as he works out his plans in their lives. This is God, well and truly at work here. Boaz does turn up, as we know. And as soon as he learns who Ruth is, he immediately begins to show her special favour. I don't know if you noticed, but it kind of builds up over the course of the day. Firstly, he says, oh, no, yeah, it's fine. You let her carry on gleaning there. And then a little bit later, it's, actually, why don't we invite her in to come and glean behind the women who I've got working for me, the ones who are going along behind the men and picking up all the stuff that haven't been picked up by the men. And then a little bit later in the day, it's, would you like some lunch? Go on, have some lunch on me, and go and get a drink whenever you need it, because you might be thirsty by now. And then a little bit later in the day, it's, actually, you know what, just go with the men. Go with the men and walk among the sheaves and basically take whatever you like. And then a little bit later on, he's saying to the men, look, just chop down the sheaves and hand them to her. It's literally, give her the food. Let's do anything we possibly can to get the food into her hands. Boaz shows such favour. and such grace towards her. And Ruth is stunned by this. And she ends up saying to him, as we heard, why? Why would you do this for me? Especially me, a foreigner, an outsider here. Why are you showing me such favour? Boaz's response is fascinating. He says, well, I've seen what you've done for Naomi. I've seen that hesed, that covenant faithfulness that you've shown to her. I've seen how you came with her, leaving your land, your people behind, coming to live in this strange place where you knew that you would always be an outsider and a stranger. I've seen that love that you've showed. And I pray that God will richly reward you as this God, my God, brings you under the protective refuge of his wings. Boaz seems to realize something here which, as often we've forgotten in Israel's history, and perhaps is especially being forgotten today. It's a deep truth that we discover in the story of Israel, going right back to that first calling of Abraham, way back in Genesis 13. That Israel, yes, is God's special covenant people. They are his chosen ones, the ones whom he has chosen to walk with especially, the ones who he will show his covenant faithfulness to, the ones he will protect and watch over and guide and give so many blessings and so many different things. But the covenant was never meant to only be for them. The covenant was never meant to only be for them. Instead, God's choosing of Israel, his election of Israel, the covenant promises he makes to Israel, was always with the intention that through them, his covenant blessing, his covenant promise would spread to bring in people from all nations, all parts of the world, people of every colour of skin and tongue and tribe and all the rest of it. That covenant would spread to all people, that God would redeem all things. And of course, we see that fulfilled in its entirety in the New Testament as we see Jesus dying on behalf not just of Israel, but of the whole world. And then as Paul and the other New Testament writers unpack that in Romans and various other places, trying to get them to understand, no, listen, you need to understand that you who are in Christ, you've been grafted into the covenant now. You have been brought under God's protection. You've been brought under the cover of his wings. The image of God with wings here is of course like an eagle hovering over its nest, providing so much protection to the people under him. You've been brought in, we're told in the Bible. But Boaz sees that happening now. You are an outsider. You're one who has traditionally been understood as our enemy. But God wants to draw you in and pour out his blessing upon you. This is a massive moment in the history of Israel, this turning point as they start to look beyond their borders and see others drawn in to join them in God's covenant faithfulness. But the other thing that Boaz realizes is that this covenant faithfulness of God, this blessing of God that he wants to pour out on Naomi, it's not some abstract thing that can just be talked about in an offhand way and then they can get on with their lives. Thoughts and prayers, may God bless you in the midst of your suffering. No, the covenant faithfulness, the covenant blessing of God, what God wants to do to Ruth to reward her for her own covenant faithfulness, is taking concrete, tangible form. It took concrete, tangible form in Ruth when she blessed Naomi, and now it's taking concrete, tangible form through Boaz as he blesses the both of them. Which raises the question, doesn't it? In what ways do our lives prove to be a source of God's covenant blessing for those around us? In what ways are we extending that protection? In what ways are we seeking to make God's love known? as Ruth returns home to Naomi, bearing with her this massive bundle of food which neither of them were expecting, but suddenly she's got. And Ruth's stomach, of course, full at this point from all the grain that she's been given at lunchtime, so much so that she's able to give some of the leftovers to Naomi. As soon as she gets back, we begin to see some more details emerging. And you can imagine, again, the audience at this point pricking up their ears a bit as it seems to be starting to come together as Ruth explains what has happened, and Naomi realizes that it's Boaz who's given her all this blessing, and he's able to say, bless him. Again, it's that word, hesed. Bless him, Lord, for what he has done for you. And then that little mother-in-law comment, and he's our kinsman redeemer. You can already hear Naomi beginning to plot in her mind and begin to move the chess pieces around as she can see the way that it is starting to come together. And of course, the audience are with her all the way here because they can see how this might begin to resolve. They can see how God's blessing might start to play out in their lives. And of course, Naomi and Ruth, they're still a long way from things being finally settled and secure. Ruth continues to go back for every day of the harvest, continues to receive Boaz's blessing, but of course the harvest isn't going to go on forever. And then where are they going to be? And then what is going to happen? There's more to this story to come yet, but the audience are beginning to feel, to hear that glimmer of hope once again. Maybe it is going to be okay. Everything seems to be going in the right direction, continuing on that upward trajectory. But perhaps as well, as those original hearers pulled a little bit closer to the fire and wrapped the blanket a bit more tightly around themselves, straining, eager to hear where this story is going and how this is all going to work out. Perhaps they're also beginning to realize that this isn't just a story about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. This isn't just a nice story to tell on dark and cold evenings about these people, a nice love story. It goes with those rom-coms we were talking about earlier. No, there's more going on here than that. This is God's story. This is the story of God's covenant faithfulness poured out on all his people. The story of his salvation and redemption. It's the story of the God who doesn't cause bad and evil things to happen in our lives, but sometimes allows us to live out the consequences of our actions, including the brokenness of the world in sin. It's the story of a God who takes all our personal stories, all the twists and the turns and the highs and the lows of our lives, the joy and the pain and the love and the suffering that we've all lived through in different ways. Who takes each of us as we are, takes our lives as they are, takes our stories and interweaves them with his own. Gently working, gently shaping all things towards his purposes. And that doesn't nullify our suffering, of course. It doesn't nullify our pain. It doesn't negate it. We're not expected to go, oh, that's all right then. We just need to keep heading towards this future we have in God. But perhaps it's to recognize that even at those times in our lives when we are feeling like Naomi, so bitter, so low, utterly crushed, like there's nothing left for us, that doesn't need to be the case. Because we worship a God who can take us even at that moment, who can take our story, take our life, and weave and shape it into something new and something good. That's what we see happening here, of course. For Naomi, in her bitterness, in her destruction, in her just feeling completely crushed, feeling like she must have been outside the sphere of God's blessing. God says, no, I've still got blessing for you yet. That's what we see in Ruth. The outsider, the one whom nobody expected would be blessed by God or indeed be a source of blessing. And yet here God is, weaving her story into his, drawing her in under the protection of his wings, his covenant faithfulness, and saying, you also are my child. I have so much more for you. My friends, my prayer for us this morning, as we too await the resolution of this particular story, is that whatever we come with today, whatever the shape of our lives at the moment, whatever we're feeling, whatever the story of our lives, that we too will be able to understand that whoever we are, whatever we've done, there is nothing that places us outside the sphere of God's blessing. Nothing that can wrench us away from his covenant faithfulness, his goodness, his mercy in our lives. And will we be able to see and know and understand how gently, imperceptibly almost, he is weaving our stories into his, bringing healing, bringing goodness, bringing forgiveness, bringing redemption and reconciliation to each one of us. May we be alert to all the ways in which he is showing us his covenant faithfulness, drawing us in under the protection of his wings. Sometimes that will come from very unexpected sources, even a Moabitess who knew. God is at work throughout his world. And may we too be shaped as a people, able to make known, able to show that blessing, pour out that blessing that God has for everyone, here in this community, here in our country, here all around our world. Calling people to come and, like Ruth, find their refuge under the wings of the Lord our God.